Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the 8th Consulting Parties meeting for the Smithsonian's South Mall Campus Master Plan. And in particular, thank you to the National Capital Planning Commission for hosting us this afternoon. We appreciate it. I'm Al Horvath, the Smithsonian's Undersecretary for Finance and Administration and Chief Financial Officer and the co-chair of the Smithsonian's Leadership Steering Committee for this effort. Since the last Consulting Parties meeting in October, the Smithsonian has been busy working to develop master plan alternatives responsive to the feedback we've received from our stakeholders, while ensuring that the plan addresses the Smithsonian's long-term needs. The impetus for this master plan was the realization some time ago that virtually all of the buildings on this part of the Smithsonian, bounded on the west by the Sackler Gallery and on the east by the Hirshhorn Museum, will require significant renovation over the course of the next several years. We established some key goals that this master plan was hoping to address in thinking about all of these projects in a holistic way. So those key goals are castle restoration with enhanced and increased public space, a central loading and mechanical plant that would supply services to all of the buildings in this location, quad museum entrances relocated closer to the mall rather than closer to Independence Avenue, replacement of the quad roof membrane, which is reaching the end of its useful life and beginning to show signs of wear, increased access to castle amenities from expanded Haupt Garden footprint, an improved east-west campus circulation at grade from the Freer to the Hirshhorn, an accessible entrance to the Freer, below-grade connectivity of the castle and quad education, visitor amenities, and museums, support for both interim and long-term programming within the Arts and Industries building, and finally, more up-to-date perimeter and building security for all of the facilities in this precinct. Our consultant team from the Bjarke Ingels Group, including landscape architect surface design, will be sharing alternative F, because it's the next letter in the alphabet, which meets the Smithsonian's needs while retaining many of the present well-loved features and qualities of all of these buildings and our Enid Haupt Garden. This alternative minimizes level changes within the garden, substantially reduces excavation under the castle, and supports our museum, education, and visitor services with additional connected space and the expanded centralized mechanical plant and loading facilities required for long-term sustainability. Alternative F has the strong endorsement of our Master Plan Steering Committee, leadership, and Smithsonian Secretary David Skorton. We will also be previewing our schedule and topics for our upcoming meetings as we proceed toward completion of the Section 106 and NEPA process, with the expectation to submit our draft master plan to NCPC for their review early next year. So at this point, let me turn it over to my colleague, Michael Carancho, who will take us through today's run of show.
Very good. Thanks very much, Al. I'm very honored to be your facilitator once again for this meeting. Once again, I'm here to help the collaboration process while keeping the meeting on track and focused. So I'm not here to answer any questions or render any opinions. That's for the Smithsonian staff that are here around the dais. I ask that you be respectful during the meeting. I ask that you also be recognized by me in order to have the floor. You do this by raising your hand. I'll acknowledge you, and then once recognized, you are welcome to come to the podium to use the mic here. There are also mics on the dais. It is push to talk and then push to not talk, and I believe they're probably synced that only one person can be using the mic at one time. So please help us with the management of that. If none of those options are convenient, I have a mic. I'll bring you the mic. Michelle Spofford on that side of the room has the mic on that side of the room, and she will bring you the mic if I acknowledge you on that side of the room. When asking a question, please introduce yourself and your organizational affiliation, if any. Questions and answers should be concise and focused. And if questions and answers take too much time, we may institute a time limit in order to keep the meeting going and make sure that we can have as much participation as possible. Also, remind you that written questions can be submitted anytime after the meeting until May 17th. So if you don't have an opportunity to ask a question here, or you need a little bit of time to compose your thoughts and your question, you have the opportunity to do that and submit that question in writing. We should only also have one conversation at a time to ensure that all ideas can be heard and understood. So please, no side conversations or interrupting the speaker. Today's meeting is going to focus on alternative F. Future meetings will discuss adverse effects. So we'd like to limit our questions to the discussion with alternative F. As we started promptly at 3, the meeting will conclude promptly at 5. We're webcasting the event, so please be aware that both your likeness and your voice are going to be recorded. We have ASL for the hearing impaired. The structure of the presentations are going to be 3 presentations. The first presentation is going to be the NEPA process update and summary of alternatives. Second will be beginning the discussion of dismissing alternatives. And the third will be the next steps in assessment of effects process. We'll have a break between each one of the presentations. So there'll be the first presentation and then a Q&A period, the second presentation, a Q&A period, and the third, and a Q&A period. So we've divided it up so that you can focus your questions on each of the presentations as they're presented. In that vein, we ask that you hold all questions until the presenter has concluded and until we open it up for the Q&A period. Again, if you don't have an opportunity to ask a question, you have the opportunity to submit a written question until May 17th. I'll start by saying, are there any questions with regards to the guidelines and the format of the meeting? Okay, if there's no questions, we'll go to our first presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Ann Trowbridge, Associate Director for Planning at the Smithsonian. Welcome to our 8th Consulting Parties meeting. This is our agenda, which you have before us. And I just wanted to briefly, for those, especially for those who may be new to these meetings, let you know where we are in the process. We're kind of in the middle. We have defined the undertaking and initiated both a Section 106 process and a NEPA environmental impact assessment. We are completing the identifying of historic properties. This has included the preparation of a CLR, a cultural landscape report, determinations of eligibility for the Quadrangle Building and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. And recently, the Committee of 100 has successfully presented a nomination of the Quadrangle Historic District to the District of Columbia Historic Preservation Review Board. That occurred last week, and that will be moving forward. We are working to begin the process of writing the nomination for the Hirshhorn Museum's nomination to the National Register. We are also preparing historic structures reports for the Sackler Gallery of Art and the Hirshhorn that will be useful in guiding future projects at those museums. This meeting, we will be looking at 2 new alternatives, one that had a short life called Alternative E, one which we think is very much more promising, which we've called Alternative F. And then towards the end of the meeting, we will discuss the next steps, which involve narrowing down those alternatives to the ones most distinctive to carry forth for analysis in the Section 106 and EIS process. And we will be scheduling a meeting in the future to begin that process. With that, I'd like to introduce our consultants, Aaron Coakley and James Lord from BIG and Surface Design, who will present Alternative F.
Hi, I'm Aaron Coakley from BIG. So I wanted to first start with a review of the previous alternatives, just to catch everyone up to speed of where we are. We started with alternative A, which was a restored castle and unchanged loading facility. So that's what you see on the screen right now. Alternative B, castle restored, but we are moving the loading facilities to a consolidated location near 12th Street, as well as re-roofing the quad building. Alternative C, this includes the loading facilities relocated, the castle restoration, as well as reconfigured museum entries and additional skylights. One of the more outstanding features of this is a level grade condition from Independence to the castle, and there will also need to be an additional visitor entry location that could either be a stairway or a pavilion. Alternative D, this was the initial preferred master plan alternative that we had presented. Again, it contains the elements of the loading facility, the castle restoration, a centralized mechanical plant, a restored castle, and this will be providing access to the expanded below-grade visitor center through a sloped grade change in front of the castle. This alternative also includes a renovated Hirshhorn sculpture garden. We had received comments on these various alternatives, and this is a quick summary of them. Too much excavation under the castle. The impression that the castle is floating, that's created by that slope change leading to the visitor entry. The gardens lack the secluded quality of the existing Haupt Garden. The slope grade change in front of the castle is not in keeping with the historic precedent of how the castle is seated with a forecourt. Removal of the existing museum pavilions, removal of the Renwick gates, loss of a distinctive garden edge, loss of an understanding of the garden and the quad space as a whole. There's more of a bleeding out into the rest of the Independence Mall. And then also the removal of the Hirshhorn walls. So these are all comments that we've heard from the public and we've taken seriously in our new proposed alternatives. And I just wanted to do a quick encapsulation of the alternative D comments. That was the Haupt Garden appeared too park-like. It didn't have the intimate quality and the horticultural diversity that the existing Haupt Garden has. The sloped entry to the visitor center created an appearance that the castle was sitting on a glass plinth from Independence Avenue. And the too much excavation under the castle. We were locating the mechanical plant and the loading dock area under the castle. And these were all of the items for alternative D that we have looked at once again when we developed our new alternatives. New alternatives. Alternative E, this is one that we had reviewed in-house with the design team. We have decided not to move ahead with this alternative, but we felt it was worth sharing some of its features with the public. This alternative primarily focused on maintaining the character of the existing Haupt Garden, the intimate spaces, the horticultural diversity, but we were still maintaining the sloped entry to the visitor center because that provided accessible access as well as daylight to the visitor center. And we also still had the excavation under the castle for the centralized mechanical plant and for the combined loading dock. This is a plan of it. We still have relocated museum pavilion entries. There's still a change of grade, but as you can see, we are trying to maintain the features of the existing Haupt Garden. Parterre, Moongate Garden, under this icon is actually the fountain garden. But the slope change we felt was unsuccessful with a traditional garden. So we've decided to dismiss this within the team and then develop a new alternative, and this is alternative F. In alternative F, again, we're looking to keep the character of the Haupt Garden with the new garden layout. We're also looking to maintain the historic relationship of the castle to the surrounding grade. So we're trying to keep the forecourt of the castle level. And we're also trying to limit the extent of excavation under the castle. So we are no longer placing the central mechanical plant beneath the castle. So I'm going to do a step-by-step process to show what are the prime features of this alternative F. So we're restoring the castle. That will mean doing seismic bracing as well as restoring it to its period of significance. We are combining the AIB loading as well as the quad loading area to 12th Street. 12th Street, from 12th Street, we're looking to have a loading ramp that leads to a combined loading facility that's below the west wing of the castle. We are looking to add a below-grade visitor center in between the castle's existing basement and the quad. We are also looking to add a centralized mechanical plant, but rather than under the castle, we're looking to add this between the AIB and the existing quad building in what is previously unexcavated area. This is a diagram of the combined below-grade areas: loading, visitor, combined mechanical. This diagram shows the existing footprint of the quad building. And in order to provide access to the below-grade visitor center, we are looking to add 2 access stairs rather than the sloped surface. So this will provide the majority of the visitor access to the expanded below-grade visitor center, and we will also be utilizing the existing elevators within the castle to provide handicap access to this below-grade visitor center. To increase the visibility of the museum pavilions to the mall, which is where most of the visitors come from, we are still looking to relocate the museum pavilions closer to the mall following the McMillan line, and we're also looking to reduce the size of the museum pavilions. To increase daylight for the below-grade spaces, we're looking to add skylights, both for the quad and at the perimeter of the castle. We think that this will provide a good amount of illumination, of natural illumination, for these below-grade public spaces. Rather than encroaching on the castle with the access stairs, we are looking to move the access stairs closer to the museum pavilion entries. This will give more room to the castle so that it's more in keeping with its historic setting. We're looking, as was said previously, to increase the east-west connection, so that will also involve adding an accessible entry to the Freer building. Currently, the accessible entry has to take place off of Independence. We're looking to move the accessible entry to the Haupt Garden area. We're looking to maintain the parterre to act as a forecourt for the castle. We're also looking to include intimate gardens, much like the existing fountain garden and the existing Moongate garden. We're also looking to add additional teaching gardens. These are referred to as terraced gardens in this scheme. Rather than linear paths connecting the east-west circulation through the gardens, we're looking to do meandering paths to create a more intimate space where people can gather and relax. Another nice feature about moving the museum pavilions is the connection of the Southwest Eco District to the Haupt Garden. Now the Haupt Garden will act as the head of the Southwest Eco District in connecting it to the mall in general. And this is showing the improved circulation from the mall to the pavilions for the museums, as well as to the visitor access stairs. So I'm going to, at this time, turn this over to James, and he will walk you through the garden features.
Thank you. My name is James Lord. I'm from Surface Design, Landscape Architects. I get the exciting part about talking about the gardens, which I think is one of the most special parts of this campus, the Haupt Garden. And this is only featured in understanding the existing character of the gardens, the seasonality, the diversity of the kinds of plant materials, sort of this intimate scale that you sort of move in and out of right now, and then also the educational component where, you know, they were very forward thinking, like Haupt Garden, and thinking of how people could engage with plant material, how they can negotiate and understand what it is to make a garden. And I think that was mentioned earlier, that I think one of, quite rightly, a critique was that we don't want this to look like a park. We want this to look like a garden. And that uniqueness, as it sits within the bigger institutional area, is really important for us. So what we did was we've done a series of these miniature sort of critiques, or what the character could be, because it's really hard to talk about landscape. Architecture is really easy. You know what a building looks like, you know, above all the stair and all that stuff. For us, for landscape, it's much more ephemeral. It's about living materials. So we create these little snapshots to give you a sense of what the garden could feel like and what makes it so important for us. Here, the parterre, which is the most amazing part about the garden that leads up and sets up the castle. What's interesting now is that you can't really access it. So what we're proposing, we could be looking at a parterre that you can actually engage with and walk through and understand and look at the seasonality of the things. As we talked about the smaller scale gardens, they could be thematic gardens. Again, this is not what we're proposing, but we're just trying to give a sense of scale of what the landscape could look and feel like, where there's a structure to it, but an unstructured approach. And thinking about spatial difference, where you have opportunities to, again, feature some of the artifacts that we have already. And there's a whole rich collection of pieces that could be featured within the gardens themselves. So there's something that you walk through garden paths and you stumble upon something. You stumble upon a room or a place to sit, and that's really what we're striving for with the Haupt Garden. And the engagement with the buildings themselves. I mean, there's this notion that, you know, you could be, we don't want this like a runway that you're running through to the mall. We want these moments along the edges that you can stop, have a drink, or rest, or get out into the shade, or get some cover, but at the same time, always engaging with the landscape. What is going on with the plants at the seasons, and what's going on, you know, horticulturally, or even in terms of the latest technology in horticulture. And thinking about the entrances, again, always having that sort of intimate zones, but then also featuring, as you can see, so here's some of the sculptures. This is a reimagined entrance to the AIB. But the terrace gardens also become a really important component that aren't there right now, and the gardens group really is striving for a place, and not a big place, just a small intimate space where education could be happening, where you could come and sit on an area and hear about the stories of the plants and about the Smithsonian itself and the adjacent museums. Where we do have walkways, it's really important for us to, in essence, lay a structure of trees, allays, that help you move through the garden, to orient yourself on when you want to go through, and where the larger, more open pathways then connect to the eddies of the more intimate spaces next door. The trees themselves become absolutely critical. It's all about the shade. It's about giving that character, that sort of defined edge that is really important for people to enjoy and stop as they move through. Along Independence, again, really important, and this is our front door on one side. The idea of working with the street tree network that is already there, doubling it up, creating this sort of cathedral of trees as you integrate. There could be even a whole experience of lilac or something that are integrated within the fence systems so that they visually are separated. But you go beyond that, you actually experience, as you can see here, the gardens beyond, the sort of meandering paths, these sort of intimate spaces, and how the different kinds of trees can be featured. Here's a cross-section of sort of what that could feel like. Again, we all know we live in a real world with security issues, so those are seamlessly integrated in the landscape. There isn't something that hits you in the face. It's really about that integration of security. And this is a basic partie diagram that sort of talks about what we're trying to look at. So the Downing plan was much more about that meandering pathways, the way you would work through a space, where the Haupt Garden, which is formal quality, gives us that sort of stateliness of being a formal estate garden in front of the castle. And how we're interpreting that desire of illustrating both those kinds of experiences within one garden is the alternative in the F Garden. And as you can see here, this is a really quick diagram, but this where those sort of spaces are. What's great about this thing is it's totally flat. It's universally accessible, and it's really important, especially the engagement with the Freer Garden, where we're getting basically people flowing from that into the garden where we never did before. And what's also amazing to think about is the amount of space that we'll actually have in this option. This is a site plan of what it could really potentially look like, and I'm just going to walk through it a little bit. So you start to see the formality of the parterre garden that then sets up and organizes the front entrance to the castle. Again, the restoration of those amazing magnolias that I come every spring to watch, that starts to create those lovely orientation devices that brings you to the front of the castle. The series of the sort of meandering gardens that you see here to the along Independence, where you can see the meandering paths that you can integrate into. And then those sort of terrace gardens that tuck in here that allow, again, the community and school groups to have a place to hang out and learn about the gardens rather than just trying to squeeze in on a path or two. As you can see along this edge here, this is the universal access to the Freer that we don't have right now, which gives us great direction. And then the opening up and visual connection of the pavilion entrances and stairways from the mall. One of the key things that we've done here is by the removal of this pavilion here, we've now got the most amazing connection to the mall itself. By, again, organizing an alley of trees along the edge of the castle, and that, as Aaron wrote, pushing the stairs away from the castle, really grounding the castle in a landscape, we have the opportunity actually to get visual connections to the Washington Monument, which are not there right now. So it's going to be a real opportunity to understand the landscape and the larger memorials on the mall as it was in. The Rose Garden, which has been newly renovated, sits right here. It's an amazing, again, the sense of getting a floral, fragrant experience as your first integration when you're coming from the mall becomes really important this way. The ceremonial entrance of the Freer is honored and respected as you sort of move through on the south. But what's really interesting is again, you notice there's no building going across here. Thank goodness. You get the connection here of a landscape. So what's really important are the gates. The gates I know are new, but they're actually really amazing, a beautiful quality of workmanship that went into understanding those gates. And in landscape terms, there's some lovely portion that you're going through a series of garden gates into a garden. Helps becomes a threshold that is really important. So the keeping of the gate and integration of the security system along there, it becomes really important in the scheme. The other really sort of opportunity that we have here is the removal of what I call the death by asphalt parking lot that's over here, and the restoration of the Ripley, which is this beautiful experience we have right now. I know it's really interesting because you're almost squeezed between the walls of the Hirshhorn and whatever construction shed they have out there. But the gardens and the garden makers who in the gardens are so beautiful as you sort of move through that we're looking to build off that experience and then expand in this area over here and to open a very small opening through the wall at this point to reinforce that sort of east-west axis that'll from the AIB to the Hirshhorn. So that people can actually appreciate and love the Hirshhorn landscape, which is a modernist landscape that is staying intact and we're not touching, which is a really important linkage here. Even though it's a very small, tiny little move, it's really important for the flow of the whole South Campus working together. Other areas that we're looking is this area here. They're adjacent to the side entrance of the AIB on the side. This is a flexible space there's lots of gardens, the tropical gardens and orangeries and that the gardens currently have and rotate, so it becomes an exhibition space. for the garden. So though every time you come by along the Ripley, you'll be experiencing different kinds of landscapes, as it is seasonally and appropriate to bring the plant material out and exhibit it in this location here. Okay. So here's just a quick sort of layup of just layering a landscape. And it's really important. What's interesting when I start clicking through this, you can start to see this notion of pulling the land, having a landscape in front of the castle becomes really important. And that connection to the mall behind it is the other portion. So the castle really layers into a bigger landscape. But the more intimate landscape starts to pull forward as you sort of move forward into the picture towards Independence. You see this. This is the new alley of the flowering trees that frame the view to the memorial. And then the pavilions themselves. So what the architects have done is push the buildings to the back, off of Independence, and creating a much larger potential for a cohesive landscape in the front. And even then, it's been cut down and squeezed and tightened so that we really frame the architecture of the castle, which is so beautiful. And then to think about it not as these series of these pavilions, because I'm a landscape architect, I see it as a landscape. So we in essence take the buildings away and expand the Haupt Garden up on top, so that literally all we have is landscape in front of the castle. We don't have any more structures, because you have to think about what's there now when you're on Independence and what's blocking the views. Now we have a large continuous garden in front with great opportunities, including the parterre. The reinstating of the parterre is very critical to set up the formal character to the front door of the castle. And then how that is reinforced with the trees and the magnolias, and then how that layers up with the plantings along Independence, and then the intercreation and the majesty of the gates as they sit in front to really start to say, I've arrived somewhere. I am somewhere different. I'm not on the mall. I'm not on Independence. I'm in a garden. I'm in the Smithsonian's garden. And that becomes really important because we also have to think about what's going to happen across the street. And that whole layering of the experience from the new eco-district, which is going to be a completely new group of people coming in and enjoying the gardens. So you see here, I put this one in. It's sort of funny. Look what's missing, that building across the street. So it's really important to think about the future and what the garden is going to mean for everyone that working and living along that new axis in the eco-district.
So beyond the garden, we also were looking at important elements of the castle itself and the historic setting of the castle. Relation to grade, this has already been illustrated by the landscape portion, but we know the importance now of keeping a level grade on the north and south sides of the castle. This is a engraving from the 1850s showing the north side of the castle. This is a photo from the 1870s showing the level grade in front of the castle, as well as the expansive view of being able to see the entire castle from Independence. The existing garden currently has that level relationship. Alternative D had that slope surface. The reason behind Alternative D's slope surface was we were trying to provide accessible entry as well as daylight into the below grade areas, but we've realized there's other ways that can be handled. So in Alternative F, we're again looking to return to the level condition in the forecourt of the castle, and we're also looking to add select staircases to provide daylight and access to the below grade visitor center. The castle restoration itself. Currently, the Great Hall has been occupied by various amenities such as restrooms, museum shops, as well as food services. As you can see from this existing photo, this back wall was a fairly recent addition from, I think, the 1960s or 70s, and you can see that the extent of the Great Hall has been impinged upon. What we're looking to do is remove those existing walls, return it back to its period of historic significance, and move those amenity spaces into the new visitor center area that's below grade. We're also looking at restoring the Great Hall that's on the second level of the castle. In the 1960s, there was an office build-out for accessory office spaces, and as you can see from this image, they filled in some of the grand double-height spaces to occupy this with office space. We're looking to remove that as part of the master plan and return it back to its, again, period of significance. This area will create a much-needed education space as well as event space for the museum, for the Smithsonian. Below grade, that's also an area that we're looking to improve upon the current condition. Right now, the castle basement has quite low ceiling heights. It's an uneven floor throughout because there have been multiple excavations in order to provide enough ceiling height for various mechanical systems. What we're looking to do is bring it back again to its period of significance, where you can see the grand groin arches that are underneath, and this is where also a lot of the investigation and information gathering took place within the Smithsonian. They had multiple labs that were in that space. Currently, it's pretty much a mechanical corridor. The groin vaults have been covered with multiple layers of MEP equipment. So we're looking to uniformly lower the floor to provide more adequate ceiling height, and also to move the mechanical equipment below that floor so the mechanical equipment can run in this area, thus restoring it to its grand groin arches or groin vaults. The visitor center itself, we're looking to connect the castle basement to the existing quad, and we're looking to do that through the visitor center. This visitor center, you can see, provides a link between the castle basement, the museums, as well as the education center. And it's well lit through the skylights as well as through the access stairs. This is an AXO showing the entry points to that visitor center. And this is a visualization of the visitor center. As you can see, we're going to be maintaining the division between the historic castle and the new space. So what's added will be of a different materiality than what's existing. So you'll understand the division between the historic castle and the new visitor center. And as you can see here, natural daylight coming in from the skylights adjacent to the castle, as well as natural light coming in from those access stairs, creating a well-lit and welcoming visitor center that will be able to accommodate the amenities that are expected of a facility of the quality of the Smithsonian. We're also looking to restore the view from Independence. This is a view from Independence from the 1840s, which is the period of historic significance for the castle. This is a current view. Presently, the view is partially blocked by the Sackler and the African Art Building. We think that by moving these pavilions closer to the castle, locating it closer to the mall, as well as reducing their size, will then restore the castle back to its restore the view of the castle back to its period of significance. And lastly, excavation. We understood the concern about the amount of excavation that was taking place around and underneath the castle. This is alternative D's extent, and this is alternative F. We've gone to great lengths to reduce the amount of excavation under the castle. As a whole, we're reducing excavation by 20% between alternative D and alternative F. And under the castle itself, we're reducing the amount of excavation by 50% between alternative D and alternative F.
Is that 15?
50. And then we wanted to leave you with these images of what could be the potential of alternative F. This is the view that James spoke about of looking towards the Washington Monument. This is a view of the gardens themselves with their lush horticultural diversity, as well as plenty of places for seating and intimate spaces. And then the view of the castle from Independence. So I think we're open to questions now.
Great, we'll move into the question period. Just to remind folks, you're welcome to come to the podium, or if you're at the Diaz, please raise your hand. And also introduce yourself and your organization. So who has the first question for the Smithsonian? Yes, right here. Yeah, press the button.
Rebecca Miller, DC Preservation League. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in detail about, you mentioned the less excavation, everything, but also the seismic that you're doing with the castle. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
We are looking to upgrade the seismic rating of the castle. So there's various studies in place. There's the potential to do base isolation, and there's the potential to also do standard brace framing. We are currently evaluating which option best meets the historic needs of the castle. We're trying to make as little imprint on the castle as possible.
And when do you think that information will be available?
We are starting our studies this spring, and that will probably be a 9-month study.
Thank you.
If you could just turn your mic off when you're done. Next question? Yes, please.
Thank you. This is not so much a question as it is a comment, if that's permissible at this time.
Sure.
All right, fine. My name is Richard Longstreth, and I'm from George Washington University and representing the Committee of 100. I think the Smithsonian is to be commended for a sea change in its approach to this issue. At the and many aspects of the scheme. It's hard to really comment when one has just seen it, but many aspects of the scheme are quite interesting. My own view, just on the basis of what we've seen this afternoon, is that as a landscape and as a design that ties the three buildings together the way the current Haupt Garden and Quadrangle building do, I don't think it's nearly as sophisticated. It seems to me it is, and I take issue with the notion that the Haupt Garden layout is all formal. It's anything but in many of its characteristics, particularly adjacent to the Smithsonian Institution building itself, where the informality rather than a formal alley, I think, is much more in keeping with the nature of a building. The current design, and again, this is simply on a quick look from the presentation, I see as intimate gardens within a very firmly delineated box, and I think it's a terrible mistake to take the pavilions that exist now, where entering those museums is a wonderful experience in its own right, and replacing them with features that not only seem quite mundane, but really have no relation whatsoever to the context in which they are put, the landscape context or the existing buildings. The great strength of Jean-Paul Carlion and Lester Collins' design is how it preserves the character of three very disparate buildings and at the same time creates an environment that is very strong in its own right and is one of the great civic spaces that we have in Washington and arguably in this country of its period. One might be tempted to say, oh, let's turn the clock back 20 years or so to Central Park in New York in some of its darkest hours and think of all the improvements that could be made in Central Park. So let's just bulldoze it all and create a new design. We can do ever so much better than our forebears did. And this, of course, is not at that sweeping scale, but it strikes me as something that is a terrible allocation of resources to destroy one of the great civic assets we have in the city. Thank you.
Would the Smithsonian like to respond, or just leave it as a matter of the record of the statement?
I would like to, Ann Trowbridge speaking, I would like to say that unlike Central Park, the Haupt Garden does sit on the roof of a 300,000 or 400,000 square foot quadrangle building below. The above grade pavilions are 4% of the actual area of that building. And for our museums, both museums, and for the education center, the Ripley Center for Educational Activities, all of the directors of those functions have come forth to strongly urge us to develop a plan that improves that building below. And it is difficult to compromise the need to make the most of our space that we have in that building. So a lot of the driving factors are to improve the underground built space of that building, as opposed to a desire to redo the garden just for the sake of redoing the garden.
Next question? Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Howard Marks. I'm here to represent myself. I live at 777 7th Street Northwest. I worked at the U.S. Department of Energy for 8 years overlooking the Haupt Garden. Those were 8 very pleasant years of my life, looking out the window every day, whether rain, shine, snow, sleet, to see those beautiful gardens. I also, for 8 years, walked to and from the garden, through the garden on the way home, and I also had lunch there together with many other federal workers, and I think it's a national treasure. It's a gift from the Smithsonian to the people that work at LaFont Plaza, including the Energy Department and many other offices of private and public sector. Also, it's now the gateway to the wharf, and I would urge the commission to keep the Smithsonian's feet to the fire to make sure that that garden is not tampered with and stays exactly as it is today. It is just absolutely breathtaking and a real asset to our community. Thank you.
Okay. Next question? I'll allow that. Yes.
If I may respond.
Okay, I'll allow one rebuttal and then.
Yes. If I may respond, because I probably didn't make myself sufficiently clear in drawing the analogy with Central Park. Of course, there's no building, mercifully, under Central Park. But the point is that 30 years ago, Central Park was in need not only of restoration, but rehabilitation. And what has occurred at Central Park over the years since has included a number of changes made in response to a major urban public space of the late 20th and 21st centuries. And what I would love to see is, rather than throwing out the car when the radio has a problem, is to look at the spaces of a museum, of the 2 museums and the Ripley Center, and see how they could be modified to meet current needs without demolishing the entire thing above ground and below. I think we have a preservation approach which can be incremental and can be sympathetic to the historic fabric of a site, is oftentimes also the most cost-effective. Thank you.
Any further questions for this first presentation? Last call for questions for this presentation.
Sorry.
Okay.
Tom Lukie with the Commission on Finance. Can you clarify? I don't know what we're doing. Are we asking questions? Are we commenting? You said this presentation. Is there another presentation?
There are going to be 2 more presentations.
okay.
This is the first presentation, which is the alternative F presentation. And then we're going to move to the second presentation with its own question and answer period, which is going to be the beginning of the discussion of dismissing alternatives.
Okay.
There'll be a question period for that, and then the final presentation will be the next steps in
Okay.
parts of the process.
Well, I think it's probably worth just, I'd like to just raise a few comments that have to do, that are general, that may lead, eventually we'll get into the dismissing of alternatives. But I also wanted to express appreciation for the what has really been I think for after really too long a time stuck on a certain approach. I think we've really seen a breakthrough here in the last months, which towards a solution that actually I think can be supported, at least in general, reducing impacts to the historic properties, and increasing connections. Actually, I think there's been a tremendous reduction in excavation under the castle, which was an issue I was very concerned about. Clearly, there are lots of things that are going to have to happen. I think that it's reasonable to look at lowering the basement. I think there are going to be technical issues about still excavating against us, alongside the 2 historic buildings, the castle and the A&I building. If I have a question, I think there's probably 2. I think everybody has to understand that the landscape has to be removed. It's so it is a question of either, to what extent is that landscape restored. I feel like we've got a lot to work with here. I think that the question is going to be, let me ask this. I don't believe that in this section 106, we're actually not looking at a design yet. That may be, I think we're still sort of
That's correct, Tom.
framing the issue, and I think there's a lot of work. I hesitate to take too strong a position about the design anyway. I've got 3 landscape architect members of my commission, so I have to be careful about that. And I think that the real question in terms of the preservation is a very tricky one, also having to do with the retention or not of the pavilions, and what do they contribute? Are they in fact, I guess based on the action at HPRB, they are now considered contributing elements to the garden. Is that correct?
As they were before.
As they were before, okay. So that's going to be, and I think that you don't have an option in which those stay. I'm not trying to make an argument about it either way, but just to clarify, that's correct, right? You don't have a...
We do have an alternative.
You do have alternative
B.
B, okay. So that's really what I want to say. Thank you.
Can I just say 2 quick things to kind of underscore a couple of the points that you made, Tom? First of all, we will at some point have to redo the roof over the Ripley Center, which will require us to take the current garden up. Our expectation is that we put garden back, and we put garden back with a larger footprint. And somewhere along the line, I think, we did not clearly enough communicate how integral gardens are to the Smithsonian experience. We now have accredited gardens by the American Association of Museums, and we think that the visitor experience is connected both to buildings and content and gardens. And so they are and will continue to be important elements for us. The other point I would just make is we spent a lot of time in this presentation looking at, frankly, what is the backside of the castle. 75% of our visitors come to the castle and the underground museums from the mall. And so one of the objectives that we have is to try to be sure that folks know as clearly as possible that there are important programmatic institutions that are behind the castle, so that they aren't hidden treasures, but are in fact very much recognized treasures. So thanks.
Did any of that discussion spur more questions or comments for the Smithsonian? Last call. Oh,
I'm Cynthia Field, and I want to speak from my expertise as a historian, architectural historian working on these buildings for so many years. I now teach at the university. And I want to point out that the pavilions, some of these features are so inherent in the historic design that it would be the conservative thing in a preservation sense to leave them. They could be used less. They could be abandoned by the directors of the museums in order to use stairs that are, or elevators or escalators that are closer to the mall. But eventually, they would be there, and they could be used if, as often happens, we sometimes have to go back and reuse some of these resources. Would we be able to use some of the buildings that we've already torn down? Just think. So let's be conservative about this. I think that they would not interfere with some of the beautiful garden plans that you have in mind now.
Further questions for the Smithsonian? Final and last call for questions for this presentation. Okay, let's move to the next presentation.
Hi. This is Ann Trowbridge, once again, Associate Director of Planning for the Smithsonian. My colleague Sharon Park is, I hope, listening in to the webcast. She had some elective surgery this past week, so was not able to be here, but is listening into the webcast. I just want to move on to talk a little bit about the alternatives once again. We have reached a stage in the process where we'd like to begin to look at the alternatives we have and evaluate which ones to carry forward for the assessment of effects that is the next step in the historic preservation Section 106 process, as well as analyzing environmental impacts for the EIS process as we move forward. We have a no-action alternative. This alternative serves as a baseline for evaluating the other alternatives. In this alternative, we would continue our Band-Aid approach of patching leaks in the quad roof, making do with the poor mechanical systems of the castle, not moving the offices out of the upper hall of the castle, not taking out that floor, and not connecting our museums across the campus with the accessible entries and access to the Hirshhorn. We would not do the centralized loading and mechanical. We would continue with the systems, individual building systems that now utilize GSA steam and chilled water. Alternative A is one we developed that preserved all of the pavilions. This one, because it did not provide for the centralized loading or the centralized utility plant, requires us to make do with the current utility supply, which are not desirable for the Smithsonian in terms of both the quality of the steam and chilled water service, as well as their energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions. it would not allow us to make the connections to the Hirshhorn that we'd like to do through AIB, because it leaves the service and parking outside AIB, so we can't open that area to visitors. This does incorporate restoration of the castle above ground. It can provide the seismic protection the castle needs. It can incorporate a roof replacement of the quadrangle, and of course it can incorporate restoration of Hirshhorn sculpture garden walls and a accessible freer entrance. Fundamentally, the Smithsonian is recommending not moving forward this alternative because it does not truly meet our purpose and need, which is a requirement. Alternative B leaves 2 of the 3 quadrangle pavilions. It removes the small round pavilion nearest the mall, which is required to do because this alternative does introduce a centralized loading dock. And that makes it much more viable for us, although this does not have the degree of wholesale replacement of the mechanical plant that we'd like to do for sustainability reasons and reliability, costs, many reasons. It does allow some updating of the existing mechanical systems. It maintains the 2 museum entrance pavilions that are there now. It does not provide the level of underground connection between our education spaces and visitor services that we like, but it provides some level of connection. We think this one we should move forward to analyze further. Alternative C, which as it was developed was very closely related to Alternative D, which was the proposed master plan at the outset, with the exception that it did not have the sloping plane down to the castle entry. Instead, it required a separate additional entry pavilion or major exit stairs near the castle to be viable. Because this is so similar in most respects to Alternative D, with the exception of the flat plane, and because we think that Alternative F does a much better job with the level plane aspect of the master plan, we're recommending not carrying this alternative forward. This one also does not have as good daylighting as Alternative F would offer. Alternative D, we recommend putting forward. This was the original master plan developed. It meets our purpose and need. It does have all the centralized loading and mechanical systems that we sought. It allows us to repair the roofs and provide the connections among the museums, both above grade and below grade, that are central to this, with the entry pavilions to the museums located closer to the mall. Alternative E has had a short life. It was an attempt to integrate a sloped parterre and some of the existing gardens with the Alternative D slope plane to the entry. In the end, it was not satisfactory as a compromise kind of solution. our gardens didn't like it, and we would like to dismiss this alternative. Alternative F represents the solution we showed today, which we think addresses many, not all, of the concerns we've had. It also solves our central plant. In fact, the central plant location in this scheme is better than having the central plant under the castle. It limits the loading to the low side of the castle under the Schirmer Lounge and the Castle Commons at the west end. It connects on grade and below grade in the way we'd like the building to do. And it has the greater garden character that Jim has described today. So with that, we have here on this chart, and I think you all have a copy of it, the alternatives that we're proposing to move forward for further consideration are outlined in a dotted line on the chart. Alternative B, D, and F, as well as the no action alternative. And we'd like to hear your comments either now, or if you'd like to go back to previous presentations that are all on the website and look at these more carefully and provide your comments in the next few weeks, that would be fine. But we'd like to hear some reactions if you have them right now on these. Thank you.
Very good. Just a reminder to introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Hi, I'm Catherine Smith with the National Park Service, and I guess I was asleep in the first question section because I did come up with a couple of questions, just clarification points on the design. One is, I just want to confirm that there's no plan for relocating Jefferson Drive anymore in any of these alternatives. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. And then second, I didn't hear an explanation of what was going to happen at the Hirshhorn Sculpture Gardens. I know there was in some of these alternatives plans for redesign.
In alternative F, we are looking at a new design for the sculpture garden.
Yeah, so are they similar to what we saw in
Yes,
CD?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
And finally, Mr. Horvath mentioned putting back the gardens in a larger footprint. How exactly do you get to the larger
By
footprint?
removing the loading dock at AIB and by relocating the loading dock next to the freer, that will free up approximately 14,000 square feet of additional garden space.
Okay, and your pavilions are presumably smaller than?
Yep, they're about a half to a third smaller than the current ones.
Okay, and then you're adding?
Yep, but that balance, yes, we're counting that, so that balances out.
Okay, thank you.
Just a reminder, you can always submit written comments up until May 17th, so if you thought of something once you leave the meeting, or you can always do that. Further questions for the Smithsonian on the discussion of starting to dismiss alternatives? Yes.
Hi, I'm Megan Kanegi. I'm with DDOT. We've been working with the Smithsonian's team, I guess, over the last 2 years, like we all have been, on the loading consolidation, which is integral to all of the alternatives except for A. So just wanted to let everyone know that there's a process that DDOT has in order to evaluate proposed curb cut changes, and that would require a curb cut that's very close to the intersection with 12th Street in Independence, which is closer than our standard just for traffic operations. Smithsonian has done a lot of analysis on that and has documented their loading demands and the impacts on that traffic signal. So I just wanted to let everyone know that that's in process. We're likely going to recommend that have recommended that they go to our Public Space Committee to get approval of this concept. So that's happening in tandem. I'll let others at DDOT know that you're looking to dismiss the alternative that does not consolidate loading and send along any comments regarding that. But to let the group know that that's a parallel process that's been happening for some time.
Thank you, Megan, for pointing that out. We do intend to submit the formal package soon. We're going to incorporate the latest visitor numbers and then submit that. In the event that we did not reach agreement with DDOT for the curb cut, we would go back to alternative F probably and see how we would work with that and the existing loading. Thank you.
Who has our next question for the Smithsonian on this subject? Yes.
Diane Sullivan with the National Capital Planning Commission. I do want to thank the Smithsonian as well for all of these alternatives that we've been working on for a very long period of time. And I think that the alternatives that you have shown here that you would like to move forward show a range of options for the castle and the gardens and the museum entries. And from our perspective, at first glance here, I believe that we would support these alternatives as well and moving them forward for EIS purposes.
Yes. If you could turn your mic off, please.
This is
NCPC, if you could. Thank you.
I'm Andrew Lewis with the DC Historic Preservation Office, and I'll just follow up on Diane's comments. Is it primarily because you're trying to identify a full range of alternatives that you're proposing to keep alternative D? The reason I'm asking is because, as was pointed out at the beginning of this meeting, there were a lot of concerns that have been expressed throughout the Section 106 process, and arguably alternative D is the one that doesn't address those concerns. And although we have not gotten into a detailed or formal evaluation of effects, it's arguably the one that has the most adverse effects from a Section 106 standpoint. So just for clarification, is it primarily for having a full range of alternatives, NEPA purposes, that you're proposing to keep that alternative?
I think it's mainly for that reason. That is also the initial master plan that we developed. It very much meets our purpose and need. We are very happy with alternative F as it's developing, so we aren't clinging to D because it's the only one that works for us, but we also think that a full range of alternatives that have more and less effects on various environmental factors would be the best approach. And I think NCPC as the lead in the NEPA has endorsed that.
Yes, please.
So I'm Charlene Vaughn, I'm with the ACHP, and I'm concerned about the elimination of alternative A. I think as you go forward with the NEPA process and solicit more comments from the public, a strong preservation option is likely to be advanced by many stakeholders. So having that under consideration and considered more thoroughly would answer a lot of questions rather than having people challenge why it's not there. So we will document that, but eliminating alternative A, I think, is short-sighted at this point.
Hi, I'm Carly Bond. I'd just like to point out that alternative B does propose maintaining the pavilions as they currently are, the quadrangle pavilions. Two of the three.
Yeah. However, I'm not sure about the other preservation aspects of the site. Looking at it in totality, does it address the gardens? Does it address significant elements of the site? I just want to know why B and not A. Because as I heard her present it, and I have not read it, it said that A was more of a preservation alternative.
I think the main reason is that when we look at our project goals, A falls very much short of the goals for the function of the overall complex that we're trying to achieve in terms of connectivity, centralized loading, and mechanical systems, and other non-preservation issues that are part of the master plan.
Okay, next question, Mr. Longstreth.
Yes, for the record, Richard Longstreth again. I think alternative B could be the basis for a very workable solution in all of this, and I want to emphasize one, I think certainly conceptually what you all are proposing for the Smithsonian Institution building itself is very commendable and will be a great step forward in the life of that building. And I think there's room for other, we are not in any way trying to oppose necessary programmatic changes so that these facilities can work at an optimal level. But alternative B seems to be a basis for that kind of approach. I would say it falls within the realms of a preservation approach. I do not think alternative F does.
Yes, please. National Park Service?
Okay, mine should be quick. It's just a follow-up on that. I recall, but I may be incorrect, does B include most of the excavation for the mechanical plant and basically the large-scale excavation underneath the castle?
No, it has a much more limited mechanical plant, probably located between AIB and the castle, and more for serving those two buildings. Okay. And it's a little bit of an improvement, but not as much.
Okay, thank you.
David Maloney, DC Historic Preservation Office. I was also following up on both of the last two comments. And could you explain a little bit more about the mechanical issue and why you feel that alternative B would not allow you to do a full mechanical plant?
I think it's about the amount of space that we have if we do not do as much excavation. We could explore if we could create more of a plant with B between AIB and the quad. Maybe that's a variation on B that we could look at.
And I guess that's my question, whether or not the mechanical location that you're proposing in alternative F would also work with alternative B.
We'd have to look at it. I think it may be difficult without some of the work at the castle to make that work. But we will look at it and answer your question when we've really had a chance to study it and talk to our mechanical engineers. I think that a certain amount of the excavation below the castle and in between the castle and quad is necessary to make this all hang together.
Okay, sure.
But we'll look at it, David.
Sure. And also, I think you said that you, in alternative B, you would not be able to do the connection to the Smithsonian Castle basement? And is it correct?
In alternative B?
Yeah.
Right now, there is this really squirrely little connection between the loading dock at the Sackler and the castle service elevator, which is really no service elevator whatsoever in the South Tower. And as we want to renovate and create more public space at the castle with more food service, more events, etc., we need to beef up that connection of the service. Right now, there is no visitor connection underground between the castle and the quad, and that is a real drawback for our visitor services and our education programs.
Yeah, I guess my question is, why could you not accommodate that in alternative B?
It just the configuration of the quad as it exists, where the entrances and cores are, the limited connection possible to the castle, we don't think it would work. We can look at that again.
Yes,
but,
I mean, I don't think alternative B is suggesting that you cannot make changes, especially to the underground portion of the existing quad building.
That side of the quad is not circulation space. There's a lot of classrooms and whatnot. We'd have to reorganize that. And we also have those education spaces in the quad currently at the very bottom of the building, at the third level below grade. And having those so low and the castle basement relatively much higher, that also makes it very difficult to connect those.
Okay, well, I think we'd appreciate more information about that as well. Thanks.
And I'd like to follow up, and I think what we're sort of hearing is that there are some aspects, and I guess I should back up first and say that I also want to echo comments that have been made earlier about how much we appreciate all the time and effort that the Smithsonian has put into developing these alternatives. But we're sort of hearing that there are some bits of each of the alternatives that are more attractive from a preservation standpoint, and then perhaps not so much in others. But the question, what often happens in these is that there becomes a hybrid alternative that's developed. And since we're talking about this, and it seems in a very formal setting as far as NEPA is concerned, is this in any way going to limit the ability to consider hybrids so that we could maybe take some of the aspects of some alternatives and combine them with others? So it won't be a great departure from the ones that you've developed so far, but just wanted some clarification on that.
It sounds like maybe what you're asking is for us to take a look at alternative B and see if we could make it work better for some of the things that it's not doing now, that aren't preservation related, but that are central to our needs. And I think that if we were to look at that and find that certain improvements that we have not found possible could be made, maybe we revise alternative B before moving on to the analysis. So I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, I think some of the alternatives that were developed very early on did not address some of the concerns that were pointed out early in the consultation process. So yes, it would be beneficial, I think, to look at how these could be worked together.
Yeah, Tom Lukie with the Commission of Fine Arts. Lots been said about the options, and I'm in agreement with a lot of them. We're trying to get to a reasonable number, and I understand, in a way 4 would be better than 5. And so I appreciate the comments that have been made from the ACHP and others about trying to keep a really good preservation alternative. My central issue has generally been about the real impact and extent of problems created by extensive excavation. So I fundamentally am opposed still to the alternative D for all that it does. In F, I still question why you would put a very large consolidated loading dock underneath the west commons room. It's going to be a very long span space in which trucks can come in and turn around. I don't know. I would love to see some alternative study that could it be moved westward just to the west edge of the building. These are the kinds of things. I mean, I'm supportive of the general idea, but I'm concerned still about those kinds of things.
Aaron, maybe you can talk to that. We did look at that.
Aaron Coakley from BIG. Yes, we have looked at these studies and the configuration that we're showing for alternative F, that layout. That's the most efficient that we could.
Okay, well, I'm raising the question in the spirit of protecting the castle, and if it's the most, it's possible that there might be something of efficiency sacrificed for the sake of the preservation of the oldest building on the mall. So maybe we can leave that as
I think we can share some of those.
Talk about.
I think it's worth us sharing some of those studies with you. So
okay,
we've also been working with DDOT about that, and we've been sharing that information with them. So we do have those studies.
That'd be good to see, because I think that there's probably my sense is that there are probably reasonable solutions here, and I want to be able to get there. I just think that there's probably intelligent balance of impacts that you can pursue. The last thing I wanted to just say is I agree with some of these comments about we don't want to get into necessarily a mix and match, but there are certain aspects of some of these designs that are more integrated than others. Clearly, the D was a much more integrated design. It was the first thing that was developed by BIG, and it has a certain coherence. This is a comment that sort of leaps suddenly outside of the 106 preservation question. So that's something that is positive. A also has a tremendous amount of coherence because it changes very little. The other two have a little bit of a question. The one that in terms of just the design, I think that there probably would have to be some serious thinking about how all these different design ideas come together. So but I think that that's something, these are not designs, right now they're just alternatives. So I think I can support that with the idea that you have a whole process to get through in terms of refining that.
Further questions, discussion, comments on this presentation? Last call for questions for this presentation. Okay, let's move to the next and final presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Carly Bond. I'm the Historic Preservation Specialist for the Smithsonian Institution, and I'm going to talk briefly about the next steps for the master plan process. So returning to our flow chart of the overview of the Section 106 process, we're roughly halfway between Step 2 and Step 3. In Step 2, we identified historic properties and defined the area of potential effects as we discussed at earlier consulting parties meetings. After our last meeting, we are moving forward with our determination of individual eligibility for the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and we're working on the National Register nomination for that individual resource. At our next consulting parties meeting, we will move into Step 3, which is to assess the adverse effects of the various master plan alternatives on historic resources. The next consulting party meeting discussion may also move us into Step 4, where we will begin consultation on resolving adverse effects. So in preparation for our next consulting parties meeting, we'd like to discuss how an assessment of adverse effects is completed. To conduct the assessment in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, we will apply that criteria of adverse effect to the undertaking and historic resources within the area of potential effects. The larger map on this slide depicts our area of potential effects within the dotted line. Just for clarity to point out, not all historic resources are listed on this map. The smaller inset map depicts our project boundary area, which is located within the National Mall Historic District. The orange shaded area on the inset map outlines the boundary of the new Smithsonian Quadrangle Historic District, which was approved last week for listing in the DC Inventory of Historic Sites. The DC Historic Preservation Office is working on the National Register nomination for that historic district. And the regulations define an adverse effect finding as when an undertaking may directly or indirectly alter any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify it for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Now, this slide outlines some examples of adverse effects, which I won't read to you at this point, but in the assessment of adverse effects, we will consider the various components of the master plan alternatives and the effects that may result on individual buildings or on any of the larger historic districts. Any parties interested in participating in the assessment should attend our next meeting to comment on potential adverse effects of the master plan alternatives and with comments or suggestions on how to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects. And we will consider any views provided by consulting parties and the public. Oh, sure. Sorry. In conclusion this afternoon, we'd like to discuss the schedule for our next steps. The assessment of effects and dismissing of alternatives consulting parties meeting will be held in late June or early July of 2017. We expect to continue the Section 106 consultation through the fall of 2017 and will hold a final consulting parties meeting on mitigations for resolving adverse effects and the resolution document. The environmental impact statement will be prepared and a public hearing will be held in late summer or early fall of 2017. And we plan to submit the review of the final master plan to the Commission of Fine Arts in late 2017, early 2018, and to the National Capital Planning Commission in the spring of 2018. And the presentation material discussed today will be posted to the South Mall Campus Master Plan website, and we welcome any written comments by May 17th.
Great, we'll open the question period again, comments. Does anyone have any questions with regards to where we are now, what the next steps are, the schedule? Yes, please.
I don't think I heard you clarify where the NEPA comes in, because NHPA and NEPA are often aligned. So what's the schedule for NEPA? I heard you talk about the four-step process, but I don't know where the NEPA is integrated in that process.
So at this point, for our next meeting, that's when they become integrated. We have not selected a preferred alternative, so we
Okay.
started the discussion today about which alternatives we think are valid for moving forward, but we have not selected a preferred alternative. And this estimate of effects will inform our decision as we move toward selecting a preferred direction.
So when will we have the schedule for the NEPA process?
Ann could maybe answer more direct questions about that.
We are preparing the draft NEPA. We've already had more than a year ago, a shared scoping meeting for the NEPA and the Section 106. At the request of the DC Historic Preservation Office, they wanted us to advance the Section 106 process with the consulting parties really first, so that that would have an impact on the alternatives that would then be analyzed in the NEPA process. But at the scoping meeting, we did identify which environmental factors we thought would be appropriate to analyze in the NEPA, and we just beginning to prepare that draft NEPA document. So that will be an internal preparation by the Smithsonian and its consultant team of a draft EIS. We will share that with NCPC and our cooperating agency, the National Park Service, for their comments, and then after their comments are addressed, we would share it with the public at a review period. It would be posted, and during that review period, we would have a public meeting.
But from an ACHP perspective, I think we believe a draft agreement needs to be in a draft EIS. I don't see us concluding the 106 and finalizing an agreement to put in a draft document. I think the solicitation of a broader public comment or engagement of a more broader public is very essential to this, because this project has national significance, and I'm not sure that all the consulting parties here, although they are very important, represent the broader public interest. So that's why I'm trying to understand how you'll coordinate the DIS, the EIS, with any drafting of an agreement so that it maximizes public engagement. So has anybody thought about that, or any of the other federal agencies thought about that? But that is very important to us, and we put out a handbook in, I think it was March 2013, encouraging agencies to coordinate NEPA.
I think that is the intention of the process. We're just completing an EA for our Air and Space Museum, and for that, we shared the assessment of effects and a draft of the agreement, I believe, as part of what was online for the public to review.
So you don't know what the NEPA document will be for this project?
I think we would follow the same. We have to follow NCPC's guidance because they are the lead federal agency, but I think that is the intention here.
Hi, Matthew Fliss with NCPC.
Okay.
Yes, the intention is to synchronize the Section 106 process with the NEPA document.
Okay.
So when the draft EIS is prepared, it will include the assessment effects and the draft PA or whatever the decision document is.
Okay.
That's the intention.
Can you just remind us who you are?
I'm Charlene Vaughn with ACHP. All right, thank you. And we'll follow this up in writing because this is really important to us.
further questions for the Smithsonian on this subject?
Quick scheduling question, Carly. The Hirshhorn, you said you were working on a DOE a National Register nomination for it, and then a CLR. Could you give us an update as to when you think those documents would be ready?
The South Mall Cultural Landscape Report is completed and is on our website, but we're happy to share it with you if you'd like. We are just starting the National Register nomination, so we don't expect that to be complete for 4 to 6 months, probably.
But we do have the DOE that's already established. It's individually
right.
eligible, but just wanted to make sure we had all the information. Thank you.
Michelle Swafford, Smithsonian. We're also currently completing a historic structures report for the Hirshhorn. Yeah.
Okay. Also the Freer, but
More questions?
Yeah, since this is close to the end, I'm Marcel Acosta with the National Capital Planning Commission. First of all, I'd like to thank the members of the public and all the agencies involved for their very constructive comments. And I think we're on to, I think we've kind of brought this to a good conclusion at this point. I'd also like to thank the Smithsonian for their good work in trying to bring forward a new alternative, which I think bridges some of the more extreme alternatives that we've seen with more of the preservation approaches. And as we mentioned, part of our job at NCPC is to look at the range of alternatives and really trying to understand the impacts of those as well as what you'll do with the adverse effects. I also want to reiterate what Tom said. What is being presented are not designs or final designs at this point. We still have to go through this process. The Smithsonian, I think, will go through a series of iterations before they bring specific projects to our commission, both at CFA and NCPC for review. So a lot of good ideas and thoughts were put out there, but I don't want you to necessarily conflate what you're seeing today as concepts to give us some ability to assess the impacts versus a design that they're bringing forward. I think this gives us a range of things to look at and to better understand what the consequences are. So as we look at it from our commission as well as CFA and Smithsonian, we have a better understanding of how to address them in our recommendations. And I think that's a useful tool for us, but this is not the end of that process. And so I don't necessarily want to confuse the two, and I want to make sure that we all understand where we're at in terms of the process that we're here to, that we've learned about today. I think it does bring a good range of ideas on the table and also a set of alternatives that I think will allow us to really assess the effects.
Any more questions, comments?
Just to follow up a process question, if what David and Andrew were mentioning about relooking at alternative B, will that, if we are adding a new alternative, a compilation, how will that fit into this process, do you expect?
I think our goal would be for us to go back and take a look at that in our team and see what improvements we could make to be, given the comments we had today. And I think at the next meeting, perhaps we might have to make it a slightly longer meeting, but we might have the first part of that meeting be to talk about what improvements we either have made or couldn't make, or a mix of the two, and then proceed from there. If we have to separate those meetings, we'll consider that, but I think if possible, I think what we try to do is just have a longer meeting where we reported back on that.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. My one last question is about comments, the written comments. Is there a link on the website for submitting written comments by May 17th?
yes, there is a link.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Langstra.
I wanted to end on a positive note because I think this has been not only a very instructive meeting, but a very constructive meeting that can lay some groundwork for a solution that ultimately is going to be something that not only everybody can live with, but hopefully that most everybody can embrace. Since 1983, I have directed a graduate program in historic preservation at GW and have been involved in many aspects of a preservation field, and I feel as firmly now as I ever have that the best solutions come out of a very active and engaged interplay between public and private sectors. Strength in one without the other upsets the balance and compromises the results of the exchange, as prolonged, as messy as it can be, is ultimately, I think, a very, very productive one. So I, for one, am looking forward to this future. Thank you.
More questions, comments? Okay, last and final call for questions and comments. This is the last question and answer period. This is your final opportunity. We got one more, okay.
One last, on this image, the stairs that would go down, are they depicted or are they not?
Yes.
Aaron Coakley from Big. They are on the left. You can see the guardrail very faintly. Yep. It's because the plantings and the trees are covering them, so it's difficult to see.
Hopefully the visitors will find.
Okay, was that our last question? Okay, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for all your participation.